Hi, I'm Rajesh.
And I'm Richard.
This is Humanity.
Being human in an age of artificial intelligence. This season, we've been discussing how AI makes culture, and since this is the last episode of the season, we decided to make it a kind of a recap episode in which we sort of revisit some of the themes that we've discussed in previous episodes.
To go back to the culture versus technology as not as a versus, but as an and. I do think that one of our favorite concepts, that of affordance, unifies the two. It's a concept that can be used to analyze both stuff that you hold in your hands and stuff that you hold in your minds.
Right. Yeah, and we're expanding the use of the term affordance from a kind of perceptual term to something that's really about an understanding of what some tool or even something more abstract than, let's say, a tool in a more abstract cultural sense, what can it allow us to do, right? In the way that language affords certain kinds of thoughts that we wouldn't have without language, right? In the same way that having a hammer affords hitting things or, beating down nails and so forth.
I mean, this is one of the examples I use often of, say, the difference between Roman numerals and what are now called Indo-Arabic numerals, where in principle, they're both representations of the same abstract entity, but they afford such different capacities that a civilization can be built on top of the difference between the two.
Right. Yeah. The Indo-Arabic, maybe they came originally from what's now Cambodia, who knows, but those, right. the kind of numerals rather, that we pretty much all use nowadays are just so much more useful. Right? They have many more uses. They afford arithmetic operations with much greater ease than the Roman numerals do. Well, in terms of thinking about what AI does for humans, clearly cognitive affordances are, in a way, I think that's kind of what they are at first flush, is that suddenly this gives us a whole bunch of cognitive affordances.
Yeah, extends our minds. Mm-hmm.
Thinking different aspects of thought. There was some controversy last year about, is AI sentient? And that's, I feel pretty confident that's not the case now and probably won't be still anytime soon. But still, some of these aspects of thought, like synthesis and analysis, the AI they certainly allow us to do it in different ways, put it that way.
Yeah. And from our perspective, whether the AI itself or intrinsically can or cannot do something is just less important than can we do something with it as an extension of our capacities.
And some of these kinds of things that are just the bread and butter of the new generative AI systems, like writing and drawing. Yeah. These are things that are much easier for us to do now with those, in concert with those tools.
Absolutely. And as a result, it also breeds new social interactions as well, right? Because we can create text in a collective way that's different from how we would have done it in the past. Same thing with images. Same thing with yet to be seen new sensory material.
We can create them collectively, and we can also use them, use those tools as a kind of on-call collaborator or assistant. Mm-hmm. So we can, by ourselves, we can have some of the benefits that we traditionally associate with a collaborator just from this, a chatbot or an image generator that we can bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, and once that's normalized, just like calculators, right? We have been using calculators now for 30, 40 years, and it's just taken for granted that if you have a large arithmetic operation, you're going to enter it into one of those devices. And
right.
And so
now, interestingly, we still like to train ourselves. We train our children our students how to do some of these things without the devices. And I wonder, to what extent will we be training future generations of children and students how to write or draw simply because of the utility that that exercise has for learning?
I am sure, though, again, for arithmetic, I feel like what would have been unthinkable when I was a child, which is getting approximately the right answer but exactly the wrong answer, would be is actually a good skill, right? Like it's good to be know how to eyeball some kind of calculation and know what the answer approximately should be. And that feels more important now than the exact version because the machine can do that much faster. And like maybe being able to use fancy words will simply not be as interesting. You could write something in flowing prose and ask the AI to replace each one of those adjectives with a slightly more complex one if you want.
Really, what are the cognitive skills that retain their value even when we have the ability to sort of bypass them? And we've seen that already with thinking about the image generators. That's an issue that's been kind of almost 200 years in existence, that we've had photographs and photography, and yet there's still quite a lot of value in learning to draw. Even though if I want an accurate representation of Rajesh, I'm probably not going to draw it. It could be pretty good, but it's going to be time-consuming and expensive. And yet learning how to draw, and I say this as someone who's spent time in formal, I actually, part of my PhD in cognitive sciences, I managed to convince the committee that I should take some drawing and painting classes to
really
improve my visual. Yeah, and I'll tell you, it was absolutely, they were some of the most helpful classes that I took for learning about visual perception, because that act of looking carefully and putting a mark on the page to represent what you're seeing trains your brain, trains yourself to see differently. That I saw the world differently after that training. And so even though I'm like any normal person, I take photographs probably every day almost, but I rarely draw. I'm so glad that I did have that training to draw. And I just wonder what kinds of skills that are being replaced now through AI will nonetheless, like the approximate number system or drawing, and so forth.
Yeah, we can only speculate, though I'm guessing a lot of writing skills will fall under that bucket, right? That being able to make a convincing argument may or may not be, I mean, I don't think it's mechanizable now, but in 5 or 10 years, I can imagine saying, oh, create this legal brief that argues this case on behalf of that client, and the AI will just spit out the brief. But I think it'll still be important to be trained on how to do it.
Well, it's not hard to see a future where writing is really mostly editing, which is closely related, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll be tweaking outputs of chatbots more than putting out the original words ourselves.
You can say this, that in a way the internet has already done a version of it, which is curation is so much more important now than it ever used to be, right? Because there's so much information out there, and there's work that is clearly creative, which is mostly curatorial, right?
Right.
So,
right. Coming back to the idea of social affordances, and the fact that we've, at least since urbanization, we've been in environments where there's a lot of social information around us, more than we really have access to. And I wonder whether, thinking about a theme from an earlier episode, whether we will, at some point in the future, have kind of social whisperers that give us information about the people that we're surrounded by.
Yeah. Powerful people have always had that, right? They hire people who whisper exactly that kind of stuff in their ears as like, oh, so and so is coming to pitch you for X, but actually what they really want is Y. and and I think the democratization of that function is going to be interesting because it also means that a kind of social complexity is going to be a part of our lives, right? Like if you're a powerful politician today, you're always trying to think what are the wheels between the wheel, right, of social interactions. I mean, I really don't spend my time doing that, but if we all had that artificial social whisperer, maybe we would use that as a way to do second order social reasoning too, and third order.
Maybe, yeah. And I think they're a place where there are a lot of questions yet to be answered about what kind of social information is going to be available publicly. That it's pretty unclear, and we might have different systems. For example, the AI systems in China and in, say, in the Western world might be quite different in terms of the sort of data that's available to train them and who has access to the data, or let alone other parts of the world that may develop homegrown AI systems.
Yeah.
Because really, there's sort of social milieu where these systems are being used that's so critical.
Until 1989, we spent almost a century saying there are two opposing forms of government. Maybe there will be like two or three or four opposing or at least distinct ideas of being artificial agents. Right? I mean, people have already written that actually governments are artificial intelligences, right? They are huge aggregators of information. They do exactly the kind of thing that the new
governments and markets also.
And markets, exactly. So maybe AI will just make that a fine-grained kind of choice.
And thinking about social affordances, it really, I think that's an area where the society that the technology is a part of is you really can't separate them. Right, that the possibility for greater democratization or reduced democratization or greater social control or greater individual freedom, these are issues that are maybe related to the technology, but they're also dependent on factors that are outside of the technology.
Absolutely. And in future, technology will depend on what choices that are outside of technology that are made there. If, for example, you're not allowed to collect certain kinds of data, that will make the evolution of AI different from if all that data is collected and the government uses it for its AI development, right? So,
well, affordances. Another factor that really influences the affordances of a technology or the kind of interface that we use to interact with the technology. I wonder if you have thoughts about how the different kinds of interfaces, either that you and we all have been using recently with generative AI or other kinds of interfaces, affect how AI is used and experienced by people.
So I'm actually an interface minimalist here. So what I mean by that is I'm not thinking about the gee-whiz science fiction interfaces where you actually think a thought and the AI answers in your head, right? We will be more conservative in the evolution of interfaces than in the capacity of the AI itself. Part of the success of ChatGPT comes from the fact that it has supercharged a familiar interface, right? You enter text into a window and a response comes. Like if you're a literate person, that's the easiest possible interface.
Because it's sitting on top of our experience of dialogue. Like what you and I are doing right now, talking to each other, that's what the chatbots are like.
Yeah.
A bit.
Yeah. And in that sense, interfaces that ask you to do something very different.
I hope I'm not the chatbot in our conversation here.
You never know.
Sorry, couldn't resist.
It reminds me of, I will not go into random philosophical asides, but yeah, I feel like the familiarity of an interface or AI actually revealing the flexibility and the scope of a familiar interface. I think that's something interesting, right? That the dialogue is actually a much more flexible thing than we are used to.
I see. Yeah, yeah. Thinking of dialogue, I find it interesting. To me, for using an image generator, although you're entering text, a prompt, right? You call it a prompt for an image generator or for a chatbot, and yet one feels like a dialogue and the other feels like a command.
Yes. Yes.
I request something and the image generator makes it. It's not really as much of a back and forth. Of course, in human dialogue, sometimes those are not a back and forth, right? Depending on the relationship.
But I wonder if some of this is the speed, right? If the image came out within, like, if you entered a prompt and the image was essentially instantaneous, I'm wondering if we will start using it almost in a dialogical fashion, right? That you say something and you hear something back and then you say something. In the most recent update of ChatGPT, you can ask it to generate images based on the text you have entered, right? And so that feels a tiny bit more dialogue-like use of images than say Midjourney is. Midjourney feels very much in the command frame, but ChatGPT's use of images when it does it. So not only does it create images, it exposes the prompts that it used to create those images, and it explains why these are the images it has created. And so it feels like the image is now part of the dialogue.
And I'm curious how you feel that different interface results in different images produced or different experiences of using.
I can say this in a very practical sense. I have used Midjourney a little bit less than I used to, because even though the quality of the images isn't as good as ChatGPT's images, are nowhere near as good as Midjourney's images. They're still coarse and not as refined by far. But because it actually absorbs the text and creates images that are deeply integrated into the dialogue, it's somehow more relevant to that conversation. Right? I would say 50% of the time, the ChatGPT output is what I've used.
That's interesting. And it's interesting to think about the images as being more part of a conversation.
Yeah.
It's sometimes something about that's, I think, a little bit maybe not distinctive of images, but that can typify some kinds of images, such as flags or monuments, that there's sort of a almost a unidirectionality about it. That you kind of will look and obey the image in a sense. I mean, words can have that quality. I find that images are often more that way, more likely to be that way.
Stop, or all the signs that we see on the road. Yeah. And I think that the images, I actually don't know how writing itself developed, but I'm thinking that in the early days of writing, when probably people who could draw and people who could write were essentially the same class, right? I'm wondering if people would, in fact, pictographic writing might have developed because people were doing both. And maybe that's how people had dialogues, like written dialogues at that time, right? That some of it would have been experienced more visually and some of it more linguistically.
Right. Thinking about other kinds of interfaces, the kinds of AI that are used by large institutions for things like wayfinding or image analysis, and not the sort of most recent kind of personal or generative AI, my experience of those is that they're fairly godlike. That they're mysterious, they're inscrutable, they're powerful, they're quasi-omniscient. I don't know. I find that I often don't even think about it explicitly, right? It's behind the scenes. It's just reading the world that we experience, and that's a very different kind of interface or very different experience of it than with these newer generative AIs.
I would say that COVID really doubled down on that divinity, especially, for example, the fact that in the middle of this pandemic that pretty much shut down everything, you could press a button and Amazon would deliver a package to your doorstep, in sometimes in an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, right? It is pretty magical. That there's something supernatural or bordering on supernatural to this technology.
And that's one of the episodes that we had earlier this season was about AI and religion, kind of one of some unexpected ways perhaps that AI could make culture. Wondering if you have any further thoughts about AI and religion.
We had speculated on whether preachers and others were using AI to craft their sermons or other pieces of writing. Turns out they are. That's not surprising at all, right? So it turns out that in religious communities, there's as many people who are fascinated by AI as in any other community. On the practical side, it turns out that, yes, AI is making inroads into religion. The more metaphysical side of it, which is AI might transform how we experience religion itself. I am more convinced now than I was then that, yes, it's going to, right? Like, we will produce sacred artifacts. The Bible as a book was a sacred artifact, and the printing press made that artifact possible. I think that there will be sacred artifacts that can only happen because of AI.
And
they will be experienced that way, right?
They'll be experienced as sacred.
They'll be experienced as sacred, and they will be crafted as sacred. Right? It won't be like accidentally sacred, but that was the intent of the maker.
You mean using AI tools to generate artifacts that are conceived of as being sacred?
Right. Or I'm thinking that even the Bible or books like that being remade using AI, and so actually having a very different form and affordance than the current Bible, right?
It just popped into my head the idea of a choose-your-own-adventure Bible.
Yeah, there you go, right?
Which exactly. AI could be perfect for doing that kind of...
Yeah, I imagine David and Goliath like rewriting the Bible with some of the key incidents going a different way.
Yeah.
Right?
Like the ability to consider counterfactual, alternative possibilities does seem like something that AI is well suited toward.
Yeah. And something that today most humans have a hard time doing counterfactuals in general, but definitely anything that's a recursive counterfactual, right? A counterfactual outcome that then spawns other counterfactual outcomes. Most of us cannot think of a world in which it's like you've had 3 or 4 counterfactual scenarios.
You go too many branches down the counterfactual tree, and you get
that could. I think that will be relatively straightforward with these new technologies. Right?
It's interesting that as a literary genre, alternative histories, and what's the name of a book like Wicked that sort of reimagined the Wizard of Oz from the perspective of the witch. I'm blanking on the name of that sort of style or genre. It's been quite popular in recent decades.
And I think that's true of fan fiction more generally, right? A lot of fan fiction has that. I'll take an existing person or a text and then rewrite that in a way that suits my imagination.
In a way, everything becomes science fiction, where you're living in an alternate world. It could just be the world of maybe vampires and teenagers or whatever it is.
But I do have to say, I worry that's not too far away from the matrix. Like if we are all surrounded by technologies that mediate actual human to human interactions, then we're, I mean, we're already inhabiting some form of the matrix then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
I think that's surely a part of why that movie was so popular even 24 years ago, that it was
yeah.
that people saw something in that matrix even back then, and it's really only continued to grow
Hmm. Hmm.
those similarities.
Yeah. I do think that some good matrices might result, like if we're able to use AI to communicate with other species, for example. I mean, that's definitely a hot topic these days. Something that I hope to do something about myself, right? That, yeah.
And you've mentioned before Project SETI, CETI, that's aimed at communicating with whales. Are you aware of other sort of organized efforts to attempt to communicate with other species
I mean,
using AI?
uh, there are people who are definitely trying to decode the communication, like songbirds and other creatures that are obviously communicative creatures. What I don't know is if there's an organized effort at the scale of a SETI for some
Mm-hmm.
other genus or species,
Right.
right? But I think it's a matter of time. I feel like that's going to happen. SETI itself may succeed or fail. I hope it succeeds, but I think that again, the idea that this is a technology that can help us peer into the minds of other creatures, I think that's an idea as time has come.
The idea of peering into the minds of other creatures assumes that other creatures have minds, which I suspect the majority, if not the vast majority of our listeners, would view that as somewhat self-evident, but certainly within Western philosophy, you roll back to Descartes, and even more recently, that was really pretty strongly, even Chomsky, right, who's still with us, is pretty vehemently opposed to the idea of language in other species, from what I can gather.
Absolutely. I think that is going to feel like a really, again, it's going to go away from metaphysical debate to you are really misguided to think that way.
If assuming that we can find ways to communicate effectively with
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
species.
So what I've read, and I think this is where I agree, is that even if we don't succeed in decoding sperm whale language, whatever that means, right? We will still get a sense of them being embodied minds, right? Like
Being
so.
sentient.
Yeah. So that I feel like that's a win. That the depth of understanding of the sentience of other creatures is just going to increase, even if we are not like we are not getting to the stage of whale translation.
It makes it more of an empirical question. What kind of sentience do other species have?
Yeah.
And that is almost certainly I can't imagine a world in which it's not a good thing to know. Do these other species have a sentience that's similar to ours?
Right.
Is it not exactly similar, but it's different, but it's still there and meaningful? Then those are things that we want to know because they have important practical and moral implications.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things you could say that AI's impact, just as the printing press and the development of literary genres like the novel made the minds of other human beings available to us, right? Like you can read Dostoevsky and feel like, wow, what a fantastic story. And I really empathize with whoever I want, whether it is Tolstoy writing War and Peace, like that cultures that were at one time remote are now part of a common humanity, right?
Right. We can, through translation, for example, or graphical distance, and also distance in time, we can read the
Yeah,
writings of people hundreds or thousands of years ago and have some clear sense of connecting
yeah,
with other humans, right? Understanding experiences that they had.
And
And
which,
so what you're suggesting here, this could have the effect of expanding that not only to other kinds of humans or distant humans, but also to other kinds of minds that are not human.
right. And in fact, I may even make a bold prediction that it's going to be artistic developments that are as important, if not more so, than technological or scientific developments, right?
It's an interesting claim because thinking historically about the written word, it's really they went hand in hand, didn't they? The development of writing itself is part of what allowed us to experience the minds of people who aren't physically present with us.
Yeah.
Just writing and drawing, right? Both of
Mm-hmm.
those together.
Mm-hmm.
And then the printing press kind of accelerated that and allowed for things like the novel or literary genres, artistic genres that allow the connection of minds.
Yeah. And I think that we need that just reading, census reports will never give us an insight into other human minds in the way that reading a novel will. So I think it's the same thing in, however many whale songs that you record and crunch in your massive database, there has to be an equivalent uh, imaginative leap. Like, oh, this is what it's like to be a whale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Certainly, people have written about the ability of the novel to extend a circle of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That genre is maybe particularly well suited to inhabiting the mind of someone else. What
Yeah.
kinds of genres might allow us to inhabit the mind of another kind of animal, let's say, with
Yeah.
a different kind of body than us?
And not in a kind of cute way. Of course, those are also good, but something that to an adult human being feels like, yes, I am actually in the presence of another creature whose experiences are worth something.
Thinking about our the theme of our podcast on being human in an age of AI, this is suggesting the possibility of that AI might not necessarily expand what it means to be human, but it might give us a more open, maybe a more porous sense of
Yeah.
who's sentient, of other minds that are other beings anyway that are worthy of our concern.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just worthy of our concern, but also worthy of enjoyment in some sense, right? Like it's good to be able to watch a movie and experience a remote village somewhere and that life there is in a certain way. Being able to transport ourselves into that is part of the pleasure we take in consuming those kinds of experiences, right? And I think that aesthetics, not just morals, will change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as we come toward the end of the episode, I think it might be a good time for us to consider, do we have any other thoughts on how AI culture making affects the experience of being human?
Definitely language for sure, because language is such a central part of being human. I think that already ChatGPT is teaching us new ways of using language. And it may be that, the kind of single word choice writing that we are so, that good training in writing consists of might be replaced by more architectural ideas of writing, right? That, oh, this is the theme, this is how you do the composition, but then you let the machine fill in the details.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that our experience and practice of writing and therefore reading won't change
Yeah.
from these new tools. I wonder whether language itself, right, may also change. The large language models that are used for the generative AI systems, those of course it's doing a kind of remixing of
Yeah.
existing language, and I guess there's sort of a question about to what extent is remixing, creating new ideas, or in this case, though more specifically, will it result in language changing less or changing more?
I don't know. I'm thinking maybe vocabulary is not the place to think about it, but let's take something like punctuation. I mean, punctuation is relatively new in the annals of the written word, right? And it's because print makes punctuation more visible, and therefore you know how to chunk your writing. I'm wondering if AI will introduce similar kinds of features, right? That there will be ways of organizing your writing visually
Right.
or orally, right? That will be obvious to somebody 100 years from now, but we just simply don't pay attention to those kinds of things.
Right. That sounds great. Because whenever I read an older text that doesn't have punctuation, I just think this is so much harder to do,
Yes.
so much more laborious. It's hard to imagine, like, how would you come up with something like punctuation when you've never experienced it before? Once you have it, it feels obvious and clearly superior. Clearly it's something helpful, but it's hard to come up with that
Yeah.
anew.
Yeah.
Something that I'm thinking about with AI culture making and just the experience of being human, I wonder whether these cognitive affordances, having this artificial intelligence, may tie our sense of self less to our minds.
Mm.
That, especially, maybe this is particularly in the Western world, I'm not sure, but there's a very strong identification of the self with the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And here, with these cognitive affordances, doing things that we think of as core parts of our minds, well, now a machine can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make us view ourselves as being a little bit less about our mind?
Yeah. And especially if what are considered substantial differences between minds are erased by the presence of these artificial entities, right?
Mm.
That the fact that someone is considered cleverer than someone else may no longer be there. We certainly don't think of someone who does large number calculations as being particularly gifted anymore. It's like whatever, right?
We might view it as a gift, but it's almost more like a party trick, or it's not.
Yes.
It's not something that has clear value to others. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not like something that we give to others in the way that it used to be.
Yeah, and it'll be like juggling or or things like that, right?
Right. It's still something admirable, right? It's something that we can admire, but it's not really going to be the focus of large numbers of people.
Yeah. So I feel like some of that's going to happen. That just as feats of strength went from being core to your social power to being good, like you go to the gym and maybe work out, but that's not going to make you a powerful person. Right?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, I think it's some
Maybe
of that
there'll
might
be
happen in
something
mind.
similar with some
Yeah,
of these
yeah.
cognitive abilities.
Yeah. So, but the future is, as always, very hard to predict. Right.
But that doesn't stop us from trying, does it?
No, it never has and never will. Over the last few months, I have really enjoyed using AI, not just for AI, but also to think through cultural questions that I probably wouldn't have thought about, right? Whether AI makes a difference to those cultural features or not is less important than the fact that it's a lens to look at anything.
It's a lens, and often it's a mirror. It's a lens
Yeah.
that reflects back at us.
Yeah, yeah.
And that can be pretty fascinating and pretty useful.
So with that thought, this season of Humanity is coming to an end. You've been listening to Humanity, Being Human in an Age of Artificial Intelligence. Please write to us at humanity.podcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear your thoughts about AI and culture and your thoughts about the podcast. Again, that's humanity.podcast@gmail.com. We'll be taking a break from the podcast for a few months, And then we'll see you in early 2024 for season 2 of Humanity, Being Human in an Age of Artificial Intelligence.